Hello, Michael here with another How Do I Render tutorial. Today we're going to be having a look at how to render an eye in the sort of cartoony Pixar Disney style. I'm going to do all of this in Maya for a bit of a change. I'm not going to do any modeling in ZBrush. And this tutorial is going to get a little bit complex towards the end, but if you just make sure you follow through with all the steps that I do, you should be able to make it. We're going to be using procedurals for basically everything, and just a little bit of Photoshop to create some layer masks, which I'll get to once we get there. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is create a sphere. We'll go to the inputs on the channel box editor, and we'll make this 16 by 16 sphere. Then we're going to rotate it 90 degrees on the z-axis. All right, once you've done that, we'll go to modify and freeze transformations. So now that is the default orientation for our object. So generally I try and get these eyes as low poly as possible. I think I find that 16 is basically as low as I want to go for any of my characters. You could probably go a touch lower, maybe down to as low as 10 if you're really trying to be conservative, but I find that this just smooths subdivides just a touch more evenly. You don't lose the silhouette of the sphere on all sides. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is create the iris and the pupil. Basically we're going to be using these first three poly loops, so this one here, and this one here. So what we'll do is we'll hold down right click, go to edge, double click that edge there, holding shift and double click that edge there, and double click that edge there. Then what we can do is hold down control right click and go two vertices. Then we can just use the scale tool to scale that in. Actually we want to make sure that we've got that one there selected, and I'm also going to make sure I've got camera based selection on for this part of the tutorial at least anyway. So I'm going to scale that in, and then if we look at it from the side, or you can even go to the profile orthographic, we want to make sure that we're still retaining the overall silhouette of our eye. So I'm just going to pull that in a touch. Now when you're looking at this, you want to make sure that as you sort of get to the 3/4 to sort of a little bit deeper into the 3/4, that you're not losing too much of the sphericalness of it. I am going to put a glass sphere over the top of this at the end, just to sort of show you one way of sort of counteracting this and just getting sort of a slightly more realistic eye. But I think that it's generally a good idea to just make sure that you've got it looking pretty good from all angles, because as you can see it's a little bit flat, but it should be fine. So we're going to control right click again and shrink selection, and then you'll see that we've got these 3 or 2 inside ones. Just move that in a touch. You can go as deep as you like. I generally won't go too deep as a rule. Control right click again and shrink selection to be something like that. If you go really deep, once you start to get to the 3/4 again, you start to lose the pupil a bit too much, and it can look a little bit weird when you get the edge of the iris sort of obscuring it. So try and be a little bit conservative with that. So now what we're going to do is go to face selection. We're just going to click and drag and select those faces. Make sure you've got camera based selection on for this. Control E to extrude, and we're just going to move that in a little bit, and then we're just going to scale that up. And this is our pupil now. So we want to get some nice edges for the pupil, so that's looking pretty good, but we do also want to get the edge of the iris to have a little bit more of a defined separation from the rest of the sort of the eyeball. So we'll go to holding down right click, we'll go to edge, shift right click and insert edge loop. If you just go to non-subdivided, this is slightly easier to work with, and then you can look at that, and that looks pretty good to me. So obviously very cartoony. If I was trying to simulate a real eye, I would try and do a lot better job than this, but you know, this will actually get you a lot of the way there anyway, so you probably use a lot more subdivisions. But for most of the time, if you're sort of looking at it from, you know, even a close-up, you're not going to see the eyes that large. So unless you're like getting your close-up as the focal point is the actual eye itself, it's still going to look pretty good from most shots. and just make sure you've got enough indentation there for the pupil itself. So now we're going to get in here and do some UV mapping, and I have said multiple times that I don't UV map in Maya as a rule. Well, I'm breaking my rule today. I'm actually going to be doing it in Maya. So we're going to use this the side view to do some UV mapping. So the first thing we're going to do is the iris. So that's going to be face, and just select a face there and then shift and double click the face next to it and you get that poly loop. We'll do the same for that one and the same for that one. So that's going to be the complete iris, and you'll see that I'm going just over the edge there. I'm going to use a ramp later on to sort of blend that into the eyeball, as the edge of the iris is a little bit soft. It's not a hard like stop on the black or the darker part of the edge of the iris. So we'll go back down to our side view. We'll go to UV and we will select camera based. And on the right, top left here rather, I'm going to go to panel and I'm just going to go to UV editor. So now you can see that I've got a UV island for our iris. I'm going to do the same for the pupil, making sure that you go to the side view or whatever view is facing the iris or the front of it before you go to UV and then camera based. So now if I right click on here and go to shell, I should be able to see that I've got an island for the iris, an island for the pupil, and then the rest of that UV layout is the rest of the eye there. So I may actually not need to do that one. I'm just going to have a look and see if it's doing what I want it to. So what I want is the edge at the bottom here to be the edge that's near the iris, and because I'm going to be using the direction of the UV to define some ramps later on, it's good to have a sort of consistency there. So you can see that if you watch the left window there, as I move my mouse, it's moving towards, as I move towards the back, it's moving up. That's what I want. So that's going to be cool. So I'm going to leave that there unwrapped as is. So we'll go to shell. I'm going to right click. We're going to scale that because I don't need it to be super large or anything. Let's pop that in the corner there. Then same with the pupil. This does not need to be large at all. So we'll just pop that over there. And then we'll select the iris, and the iris is going to be the most important part because it's generally the most interesting part of the eye. This part's very important for what I'm going to do. So I'm going to make this big so we can all see what I'm doing. I want the center of the iris to be exactly on the where two parts of the grid meet. So like this 0.4 line here and then this 0.4 line here, for example. So I'm going to hold down the X key on the keyboard and just move that so it's going to snap to grid. You'll also notice when you do that, it activates that. You could turn it on there if you want as well. Then I'm just going to scale this down so it's not overlapping anything. And we'll move this guy just to give it a bit of space. Maybe this one as well. Yeah, just make sure that that center point is right in the middle of that. So 0.4 and 0.4, if you can line it up like that, that's probably going to make it a little bit easier later on. You'll understand later, just make sure you do it for now and you'll see what magic unfolds later on. All right, so that is basically the eye modeled. It's very straightforward, as you can see, and we get a pretty effective looking eye. It's going to look even more effective shortly. So we're going to go back to that eye and we're going to create a UV layout so we can create some masks. So in the UV window, we're just going to go to polygons, UV snapshot. You can make the size whatever you want. I'm just going to go 2K by default. I want the image format to be PNG. And also make sure I'm going to save before I do this because there's a tendency to crash when you do these exports. So also just make sure you look at where you're outputting that to. And I'm just going to change that name to be IUV. Okay, so I'm just going to navigate there and open that up in Photoshop. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've opened it up here. You can't really see anything because it's got white lines on a white background. So I'll create a new layer and I'll just go to the fill tool and create a black fill behind it so we can see what's going on here. So we've got our iris there, our pupil there, and the rest of the eyeball there. So I'm going to I'm going to go to the channels tab. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a new tab, and it's called Alpha 1. Make sure you've got the UV layout layer selected. Go to channels and then select RGB, and then use the magic wand tool. It's going to select everything except, if you click on the background, it's going to select everything except for what's inside of our UV layouts, which is cool. Then we're just going to switch over to the marquee tool using M, and I'm just going to hold down Shift and add those to the selection. And then if you just hit Control Shift I, it'll invert your selection. We're going to go back over to the alpha. So within the alpha channel, I'm just going to do the fill again. I'm just going to make sure I'm using a pure white fill. You can also just click that to make sure you've got black and white, and just do a white fill. So as you can see on the layers, channel layers here, you've got this alpha layer that's got a big white circle. So that means it's masked. So I'm going to save this as, I'm just going to save this in my eye assets, and I want to make sure that this is called something that's recognizable. So this is going to be pupil mask. Make sure you've got alpha channel saved. I'm saving this as a TIFF. You could probably save it as a PNG. I'm just kind of using TIFF as a habit. And then we're just going to click OK, and including layers, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. And then I'm just going to hold down Control Alt Z and undo that, and then I'm going to do the same thing again for the other two. Okay, so now let's get some shaders happening. So select your eyeball. We're going to go up to Renderman, and we're going to right click on the shader tool, the shader button there, and we're going to use a pixel layer surface, because we're going to be having multiple layers on this eyeball. Then we're going to go up to our hyper, I'm just going to do a quick save, go up to the hypershade editor. That's our layer surface. First thing we're going to do is rename this to be called PXR Eye. And then we're going to start working in our layers. So we need to create 3 layers, one for the pupil, one for the iris, and one for the rest of the eyeball. So this first one here, which is going into the base layer, is going to be called pupil. And then the second one, which is going to be the iris. And finally, we need to create another one of these guys. This is a pixel layer node. So hit tab, type in PXR layer, get one of those. And then you want to run the material out into layer 2. So you've got your base layer as your pupil, layer 1 is your iris, and layer 2 is your eyeball. All right, so the pupil is the easiest part. We just need to make this black. And slightly specular. Make sure you enable the channel for specularity, and we'll just set it to something like that for now. Probably back the gain off to like 0.03. See how that looks in a second. So the next is the iris. So actually, now that I think about it, I didn't need to make a mask for the pupil. So the iris, it does need a mask though. So we're going to hit tab, we're going to type in PXR text. I'm going to Pixar texture node. We're going to run the alpha into the layer 1 mask, and then we're going to open up our mask for our iris, as you can see there. So it's not actually going to use the image that you see, it's just using the alpha channel, which was just the 0 and 1 values that you saw in that channel on Photoshop. So you can name this iris mask, just to make it a bit easier to spot in the hypershade as well. So that can sit there for the moment. Then finally, we do need to create one the same way for the eyeball. And just so we can get a bit of a look at what's happening, we'll make the iris blue, and we'll make the eyeball white. We'll enable the specularity on the eyeball as well, and the same for the iris. And we'll just run a quick render to see what's happening. I'll just set up some lights very quickly as well. Okay. Actually, and a note here for lighting eyeballs, I'm going to use a disc light rather than a rectangle light, because the specular reflection on the eyeball will be circle this way, which just looks a little bit nicer. And also, if you just shrink the size of your light, you'll get a smaller specular reflection as well. And because I shrunk it, I'm going to normalize it so I don't have to increase intensity. So let's save that, run an IPR. Make sure you go to your Pixar layer mixer, go to layer 2 and enable it. If you don't, then you will not see the eyeball, which you now can. So as you can see, we've got a pretty simple setup for an eyeball. If you wanted something very cartoony, then this would be fine. But we still want to add a little bit more texture into the iris, a little bit for the eyeball as well. And the pupil is pretty much going to stay how it is. So let's start with the hard part, that is the iris. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is create a ramp. So it goes from dark to light to dark again on the outsides of the iris itself. So we'll just type it, we'll hit tab and type in Pixar ramp. We're going to run this into a diffuse color, but we also want to type in PXR manifold, and we'll get a manifold 2D. We're going to run the result into the manifold of the Pixar ramp. Why is that? Well, you remember earlier we when we UV'd it, we had the center of the iris set to 0.4. So the offset is going to be set to 0.4, which will mean that the center of the ramp is at 0.4. So to set up our iris to start with, we've got our Pixar ramp. I've just set it to blue. I want the ramp type set to circular, so it's going to create a circle ramp emanating from a center point, which we're going to define with our Pixar manifold 2D. Now I've just been testing this. You might have noticed the jump in time. This is not quite working as it did last time I did it. I'm not quite sure why, but normally you should be able to set your manifold to be the same as your UV space. Not sure why it's not working, but I'm going to roll anyway with this tutorial, and hopefully you won't run into the same issue. So I'm going to run the IPR. So as I add in nodes to our ramp, if I just add in a black one for instance, you see that point is not on the center of the UV layout, and I do want it to be on the point. So we're using the Pixar manifold to define the center using the offset. So to get that in the center, I'm just going to define it a bit more first. So if I create another black and just slide that along. All right, so you'll see we're getting sort of the ramp that's going to emanate from the iris. For starters, the circle is going to be a bit too big, so we're going to go to the manifold and we're just going to double the scale of that, which is going to in turn shrink it by half. And then we're going to set the offset. So if I just slide that offset, you can see that it disappears. We need to work in really small increments here. So my theory was it's going to be negative 0.4, which as you can see is not on center. So I think it's going to be negative 0.32 is what I tested. Now I'm not 100% why this is, because this I managed to do this using this method on my last one, but maybe I just had a bit of a stroke of luck, but we can still sort of just finagle this into position. So what we've got happening here is this node here is defining the ramp which is intersecting the pupil. So I'm just going to reduce that so it's on the center. It's about as center as it's going to get. All right, so let's go back to the ramp. So that's cool, but we do want another bit of darkness on the edge here. So I'm just going to click there and create another dark ramp. So you can see now that the eye has got that ramp, it's really starting to take shape. But we can push that a bit further. I want it to blend off into the rest of the eyeball. So I'm going to create a white there. And I just need to move this black along to the point where I can see the white. I could also be rendering an orthographic view here, which would make this slightly more obvious, but I'm just going to go with perspective for now. So you can see as I shift that in, so that's not quite in the center still, which is weird because it really looks like it is. All right, yeah, it's a little bit to the right and probably a little bit high as well. So that means it's probably going to be negative 0.3. Hard to tell because of the light, but it is. I think it's dead center there. So as it turned out, negative 0.3 for some reason. I feel like I'm overlooking something, but might be because I had to invert the texture. I don't know. We're just going to roll with it. That's fine. So we've got this white and this black, but you can see that the white into the black is a little bit gray, which isn't ideal. So we're going to make this a dark blue rather than pure black. Where possible, as a sort of color rule, sort of try to avoid using black as much as possible. All right, so that's pretty much where it cuts off there. So you just want to make sure there's a nice blend between your dark and then the whiteness of the eyeball. So I've just chucked in a middle value there just to get it to blend a little bit softer. But as you can see, that is pretty eyeball looking right now. So if we just jump back into perspective, yeah, that blends pretty good. So we will go in and work that pupil a bit more so it is a bit darker, because it's reflecting a lot of light at the moment. It's picking up quite a lot of whiteness, but that's fine. So all right, so what do we got happening here? All right, we need to get some of the little liney bits. I should have really looked up my anatomy before I did this tutorial, between the ramp and the iris. So we're actually going to blend a noise node in here. So we'll go to actually, it's just here in 2D textures. We'll go to noise. So I want to blend this ramp with the noise using a multiply. Similar to how you would do in Photoshop if you're familiar. We can use a Pixar blend node, and we'll run the color of the noise into the top and the color of the ramp into the bottom, and then select that node, hit 3 to expand it, and the RGB into the diffuse color channel. With this one, we also need to set the offset. So with the manifold, it was -0.3. So I'm assuming it's going to be the same here. We'll see in a second. And on the noise node, we want to implode it. So it's got a center like that. So let's run an IPR. All right, so that center doesn't look correct. Okay, so same thing again here with the noise. I should have be able to use the UV coordinates here, but it would appear I can't. So just with the implode set to 1, you'll see you get that nice center. And then select the place 2D texture node. I've set my offset to be 0.1, which has given me the center of the pupil, or close enough that I can't tell. So with our noise node, so you'll see that we've got this noise and it looks pretty good. I might soften it a touch by increasing the ratio, and just increase the threshold a bit, which is just basically blending in more white. You can decide sort of how wide you want yours to be. I might actually go a little bit wider this time. And then you can use the frequency to define how often there are lines. See, sometimes less is more. And then frequency is going to define how many lines there are. The frequency ratio is relative. Yeah. So just find an amount that you like. You can go as crazy as you want, obviously. It starts to look a little bit less realistic, but all right, yeah, figured it out. So implode center is how we're defining the center of the implosion. So 0.4 is giving us the center that we had in our UV space. So obviously for some reason, Renderman's manifold's not respecting the UV space layout. I'm not sure why that is. It was in my previous one, so whatever. But you can sort of play with this as much as you like. I could spend all day trying to get this to look how I want it. It's not quite sort of what I want at the moment, but it's probably going to look good enough there. So we're going to go with that. We'll go back to our Pixar blend node now, so we can actually get some color blend. We'll change from operation from normal to multiply. And you'll see that you get that. So the only problem there is because our UV goes all the way to the edge, I'm actually going to have to push that ramp out a bit further. So I'm just going to do that now. Okay. So I've just played around with my ramp a little bit. You can add in some different tones and stuff as well. And I've just created it so the center is a little bit higher value. And then the center is a little bit more saturated. I could probably go to a bit darker tone there as well. But you can see it sort of blends nicely with that noise. So that will work for the iris. So you see that's starting to look pretty cool. So that is the iris done. So we're just going to add some specularity to that really quick. All right, so I've got the gain set to 1.0 for the specular, and the face color is just set to 0.01. You could even go lower than that, say 0.005, depending on how much you want. I think maybe 0.01 is cool. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. So we have a lovely blue eye. And obviously you can change that color to be whatever you like. Now you've got that ramp in there, it makes it very simple and very versatile. All right, so the next one we're going to do is the eyeball. So once again, we're going to use the Pixar ramp. And we're going to run that into the diffuse color. And with the eyeball, we are going to make it a red to white. So I'm going to put the red just fractionally into the sort of indigo pink, and then the white is going to be white. And this is just to simulate the sort of the blood vessels and stuff of the eye. So now when we IPR that, you'll see, I need to turn that sideways. You'll see that currently it appears that our ramp is running from top to bottom. So we need to change it to be a T ramp. So now it's going from front to back. And then we just want the white to be closer to the front. And sometimes with ramps, for some reason, if you don't have nodes at either end, it spazzes out. So just make sure you do that sometimes. So I'm just going to push that white node there. And so I'm sort of happy with the amount of redness. And just, it sort of depends on how much of the eye you're going to be seeing. If you just got the eyeballs, you know, hanging out in the open like something from the movie Congo, then that's cool. If you want it to be bleeding into the sort of what you can see of the eyeball on your character, then you just need to sort of work it until it's sort of coming in. Obviously I don't have this eyeball set in an eye socket, otherwise this would be easier to tell, but you get the idea. But that's still just not quite as far as I want to take it. So I am going to add in another Pixar blend node. I'm going to run the diffuse color to the bottom of that. Run that into the diffuse color. And we're going to create a Pixar vor noise. And we're going to use this to simulate the veins and stuff on the eye. And it's fairly stylized, so it might not be what you want to go for, but I've used this just previously and it sort of worked kind of cool, so I'm going to run that into the top RGB, which is underneath the bottom RGB. Alright, so let's run an IPR, and because we've got our blend mode set to normal, that's not going to work. So I think I used a what was it, hard light when I did this last time, and then I'm just going to set up some settings. So you can already see that that's starting to maybe get a bit too gruesome. Looks a bit bruised, but that's fine. Octave set to 1 because I just want it to be sort of 2 values. The gain set to 1 because I want it to be pretty hard. The linearity set to 0 and smoothness set to 0.6. We're going to turn turbulent on because I want it to be a little bit all over the place. And now you can sort of see what I'm going for here. So it sort of looks a little bit veiny. You're obviously not getting enough values. I could probably mix in another vor noise underneath that or something like that, and then it would look a little bit more close, but you sort of get the idea. And I think I ended up actually using linear burn, not hard light. So that's cool, linear burn. Yes, so now it's starting to look like a bloody eyeball. But obviously it's a bit too intense there at the front, which is fine. We can use another Pixar ramp. Hope you really like Pixar ramps because we're using a lot of them. And we're going to set this to a value of 1 and a value of 0. And then we're going to run the ramp into, we're just going to use the alt RGBR into the alpha for our vor noise, which is the top alpha. And we also need to use the same direction as the ramp for this, so it's a T ramp. So you can see it's starting to soften it there. So the more I push this white to the left, the more it'll back off those veins. And for some reason this is real dodgy. There we go. Like I said before, you need to have a node at either end, or it just doesn't like it sometimes. Sorry, other way around. I'm going to push the black in to get it to soften. And then you can sort of soften it as much as you like. And obviously you could use a middle value if you're going to blend it even more. But you can sort of see the effect that it's having. And obviously a lot of this red stuff will be behind at the back of the eyeball, so you're not going to see it. But if you want your eyeball to be hanging out in the open, this can look like a good bit of gore. And because of the UV, it gets a bit funky at the back there, but generally you're not going to see that. And you might even have like a cortex, an optical cortex attached to that, so that's fine. But generally that's sort of the effect that you're going for, and you can see that that's you know, stylized, but pretty workable, I think. All right, and you can also just use the value of the left-hand node as well to soften it in. So that's that is the eyeball essentially taken care of. We need to add some specularity to that. So you want to make sure that you've got primary specular enabled. And then we'll just add in, say, 0.01 again. That doesn't need anything. Gain all the way up. And then the roughness at whatever you like. I think 0.2 is probably a decent starting point. All right, cool. So finally, or second to finally, we're going to sort the pupil out. So I don't want that much specularity. Actually, technically the pupil is just a big old hole. So you could have 0 specularity in it. It's not going to look as realistic if you don't put the glass over the top of it. I am going to be putting the glass over the top of it. So I'm just going to pull it. I'm going to turn the specularity off and just have the diffuse channel set to black. And, you know, that kind of looks pretty cool like that. But you could have specularity in there as well. All right, so that's fine. So finally, let's create the glass for the eyeball. So we're going to create another sphere. We're going to set it to be 16 by 16 again. We're going to rotate it on the z-axis 90 degrees. We're going to modify it and freeze transformations. So smooth subdivide it. And we're just going to increase the size. If you set this to wireframe, you might find it slightly easier to judge the size. And if you go to, obviously, your orthographic mode, you can go to the side-on view, set it to wireframe, and sort of just make sure that it's just outside the edge there. So we can probably, if you just left-click that center node, then you can just middle mouse drag to get it. So you don't want it to be too close, otherwise the refraction can become a bit of an issue, especially when you're smooth subdividing, and it can also sort of cause a weird effect. So we're just going to get roughly that much happening. Then we'll just quickly create a Renderman shader for it, just the standard one. Go back to the Hypershade editor, and we'll just call this Pixar Eye Glass. I have no idea what that's called. I should really look these things up. I'm sure I'm going to get a million comments correcting me. That's fine. So refraction, reflection gain all the way up. Refractive index, we're going to set this pretty low, 1.1, because it's so close and so thin to the eyeball itself. You don't want it to have too much refraction or it's going to look a little bit bizarre. Now you can see that there is a glassy effect happening over the iris. So whereas before it would look flat there, now it's spherical completely. And you get a little bit of distortion with the refraction as is, but that's not too bad. And if you want to go super realistic, you could actually create a bit of a lens effect on the glass itself. So we'll just go back to that and wireframe mode. So we use the three, that edge there, that edge there, and that edge there. I'm just going to control right click and two vertices those, and then select that one there. And if I just scale those out like so, and just make sure it's not clipping. If you look at some sort of medical journals, you'll notice that the pupil sort of bulges out. I could go a bit further and add some subdivisions and stuff there, but that's roughly what a pupil does. It's not perfect, but that's sort of what I'm looking for. I'm just wanting it to break the silhouette of the overall sphere just a touch. So now if I look at that render, particularly from the side view, you'll notice it a bit more. So see that bulge there? And the refraction is getting a bit funny with that, so you'll need to decide whether or not you want it to look super realistic. If you're trying to do a medical render, then obviously you want to go for realism. If you're trying to do a cartoon, then you want it to just look effective. So you can see with that, even with the diffuse, the fully diffused iris, you're still getting the reflection from the light over the top of the pupil, so that kind of helps. But because you've got glass there, transmission is always going to cause extra noise. So you need to sort of balance out whether or not you want to have the extra noise and deal with the extra render time with that. That's going to be your call, depending on what you're doing. If it's animation, you don't have any close-ups, maybe just drop out the glass when it's not a close-up. pop it back in for a close-up if you want those extra specular highlights. And though our eyeball does look pretty gory, it is pretty effective. So that's almost all, but I've just got one extra bonus bit of content for you. This is a super long tutorial, I know. I don't think I'm going to split it up either, so sorry about the length of this one. But I want to show you one weird trick for saving a whole bunch of time. If you select your sphere, both of the spheres for the eyeballs, we can actually export these as sort of like your just eyeball base, and then you can use that and you can go in and edit the colors and stuff for other creatures or whatever you're applying them to. So select both your spheres. We're going to go to File, we're going to go to Export Selection, and then we want to make sure it's set to my ASCII. And then I'm just going to export this to my assets, and this is going to be called I1. So if it's set to my ASCII, it's going to take all the materials and shaders with it. So this will make it a lot easier to just set this up in other scenes in the future. So I'll export that, and then I'll just open up another scene now and show you how I've applied it to another character. All right, so we've got our slug from a couple of tutorials ago. Just going to go to File, Import, going to go to my assets, and it was I1. We'll import that, and we'll get these giant eye. That's fine. So those two spheres there, I'm just going to group those, call that eye, and then I'll just resize this and put this into position. Okay, so there's our slug. Obviously, because of the way the eye sockets are working with this one, we can't really see the redness, but you can just see it there. So kind of makes it a little bit more effective. He's got lovely blue eyes now, and I could go and I could change those to whatever color I want just using that ramp just in the Hypershade editor here. If I just clear that mess out, and then we'll just go to I1. We've got our lovely shading network already set up, ready to go, so you don't have to ever make it again. You just have to do this tutorial once and then export it as a Maya ASCII, and you're laughing, you're in business. You can just go on, change the color of your eye to be whatever wonderful colors you want, and because it's using the same shader on both eyes, I thought. One thing I have noticed though is that it can be a bit screwy when you import it. Sometimes you just have to go through and click on these nodes, particularly the ramps and the blends. If you're finding that the colors aren't coming in correctly, I'm not sure why that is exactly. If you do find out, just let me know in the comments. I'd love to share. But yeah, you can now go in and to your heart's content, change things you want. Now he's got lovely green eyes, sort of mixed with blue. Isn't that effective? Doesn't he look lovely? And that's it. That's this massive tutorial over. Thank you for hanging in there with me for this one. I hope it's going to be really useful for all you all out there. If you have found it useful, make sure you click the like button so other people can find it on YouTube. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed, as I do a couple of these tutorials, not this long, but like this, every week for thick products like Renderman and other CG products. If you want to stay up to date even further, check out the Facebook page, a link in the description. That's it for now though. Thank you very much for hanging in there with me, and happy rendering.